So James Boyce is the author of 3 well-researched but delightfully engaging and very readable history books. His first book, Van Diemen's Land, was published in 2008 and is a history of Tasmania from 1803 to 1856. His argument for the book is that the place, the environment, which became a forced home for 72,000 English convicts, matters. The place matters. And he says it matters because it was a really remarkably benevolent land. And for convicts, it wasn't just therefore a prison, it was a place of hope for them. Unsurprisingly, Van Diemen's Land is an award-winning book. It won the 2008 Colin Roderick Award and the 2009 Tasmania Book Prize. And it was also shortlisted for a number of other awards. In 2011, James Boyce followed up Van Diemen's Land with another colonial history, 1835, about the birth of Melbourne. And 1835, I reckon, is another page-turner, a myth-buster, and therefore, again, it's not surprising that it won the 2012 Age Book of the Year Award and the 2013 Tasmania Book Prize, and was shortlisted for a string of awards between 2011 and 2013. The book we're going to be talking about today is James's 3rd book, published last year, and called Born Bad, subtitled Original Sin and the Making of the Western World. This is a book with a beautiful cover, and I have to say I'm an absolute sucker for a beautiful cover, even though I'm not supposed to be. Thanks, James. And I really, really loved reading this book. Again, I think it's fantastically readable, very accessible, very engaging. He's a fantastic writer, but there's no dumbing down of ideas in it. Rather, there's an opening up for an important discussion, I think, to be had about the innocence of babies, their genetic heritage, and the particular sort of moment in which they're born socially and culturally and historically. Before we start the reasons for the book, because it's a little bit different to your other two, James, I thought we'd set the scene by inviting James to read part of the preface, because that is a really nice overview, I think, of the book.
Thanks, Dee, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate Dee asking me to read from the preface, because it does try and say what I probably would get in a total muddle trying to say again. It took me months to write this preface. I read it with... it's great just to be able to start by reading something which I finally got as close to right as I could get. What is wrong with me? This question has haunted the West for 1,500 years, but until recently it came with an answer, which was called original sin. Western people believed they were born bad because they had inherited the sin of the first humans. Their understanding of themselves was shaped, as it has been in almost all cultures, by an overarching story of creation. Adam and Eve is an ancient myth whose origins are lost in the campfires of prehistory, making the Western interpretation of the story a comparatively recent one. The West shared the same primal parents as now vanished tribes, Jews, Muslims, and Eastern or Orthodox Christians. But it stood alone in seeing the eating of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden as the original sin, not only the first sin of human history, but also the one that subsequently became innate to the human condition. Only in this version of creation did a decision to disobey God in paradise become a sin that was inherited by all. The articulation of original sin and the making of the Western world were enmeshed. The doctrine, like the West itself, was a product of the tumultuous breakup of the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire. It underpinned the distinctive religion formulated by the Catholic Church as a Christian culture was built out of the imperial ruins. The creation story was the spiritual foundation on which the Western world was made. directing how people understood the divine, each other, the natural world, and above all, themselves. Original sin is not part of the wider Judeo-Christian tradition. For Jews and Eastern Christians, the doctrine's divorce of sin from morality was incomprehensible. It was not just the modern mind that found it difficult to imagine how Adam's sin could become everyone's, or to conceive of a God who would condemn otherwise innocent people to hell because of it. In no other religion were people understood to be born bad. In no other were they conceived with a permanently corrupted nature that faced the wrath and judgment of God. The deity of the West is unique in judging people before they commit a moral act. Those who fought against the doctrine in the 5th century argued that a newborn baby could not be regarded as a sinner. They lost the debate.
They lost the debate. Before we come back to that debate and hopefully have a little bit of a chat about that and who was involved in the debate on both sides, I'm really curious, James, about why this book, why Born Bad. It's quite different. It's history, like your other books, but it's not colonial Australian history. And so maybe you could tell us a bit about what inspired you to write this particular history.
Well, I have to confess that I think working out why I wrote this book is a work in progress for me too. I may spend the rest of my life reflecting on what I've been immersed in the last few years. But I was in Perth last week, and I did my first studies at university there, BA in history and philosophy, back in the early 1980s, and still a teenager. And I hadn't been back to the campus since I left there. UWA, and it was quite useful for me in a way, because the young 18-year-old seeker, slightly lost seeker, was there for me, and my questions, were very vivid for me, and it got me to thinking that the questions that, all history begins with a question or a series of questions, which is why, by the way, every generation has to rewrite its history, because it's not the history itself changes, but the questions change, Each culture, each point in time, we have different questions of the past. And the questions that I'm trying to answer in this book, were already in their nascent form there, and I think I've lived with them. They were questions in my own faith journey. I always found the idea of a God who somehow favoured certain people. Certain people were okay with God and certain other people were not okay with God. And how did Christianity ever get to a point, or the church ever get to a point of defining where God was or who God was with? If God was, it seemed to sort of, even at that age, to me, quite an arrogant position to take to the divine, but also in my studies in philosophy and economics, and even at that age, and it's become more noticeable to me since, was they're often built on assumptions of human nature, and we weren't really allowed or taught to question those assumptions. When I did economics, the assumption that the human being is a sort of seeking to maximise their material benefits was sort of taken for granted. But where did that come from, you want to ask. And then the other part of it, the other question is, I think I've always carried a certain sort of, who knows the right word, but in a gap or in a homelessness, feeling of not quite belonging, and in those days I used to think this, keep that to myself a bit, and just thought I was a bit of a mixed up kid, and the other people had it together, and when I'd grow up all would be all right. But as I've had, I was a social worker for many years, and it's not just that experience, but in friendships and looking around the culture that we live in, I recognise there's a restlessness or a lack of belonging or a lack of a sense that there's not something wrong, not connected with what we do, but with who we are. A sort of innate sense of wrongness with ourselves, which seems to be manifest in Western culture. It's not just a... I mean, I don't want to put that on any of you, all of you who are all, you know, happy with yourselves and together. Let's not assume that we're all stuffed here. But I think if we look around at our culture, I think few of us would be able to deny that the way that advertising works and other messages, you know, whether it's self-help movements or whether they're trying to sell us another product, they're often appealing to a sense that, you know, there's something wrong with you and you can be made better.
Yes.
So these sorts of questions are what led to the book. But in terms of the connection with the other two books, this sounds maybe a little bit glib, and it's probably is a bit. It's more than this, but I do think there's some truth in my first book, Van Diemen's Land, was a sort of exploration of what it meant in terms of this search for home and the search for belonging that I've had. It was what it meant to be a Tasmanian. You know, what it mattered that this bit of land was colonised by the convicts, not, as you said so well in the introduction, Dee, not just another bit of earth. You know, what did it mean that the 72,000 people were dumped here, not on some other island? You know, that interested me. And then 1835 was, in many ways, a reflection on what it means to be, you know, an Australian of European descent, you know, one of the colonisers. And this book, in some ways, is what is it meant to be a Western person? You know, so they connect a bit in that way, I think. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm sure there's lots of new students at the university this week wandering around and in several years' time might be thinking about their 18-year-old confused selves as well. And I'm sure all of you actually do feel as if you belong and are very happy and never get sucked into any marketing. So, James, you talk about in the book about the doctrine of original sin as originating with Augustine, who's seen as one of the founding fathers, particularly of Western Christianity. And that it was kind of personal to him in many ways because it helped him to understand his own experience of wanting to be celibate and not being able to be. But you reckon it was also kind of useful politically for the suppression of dissidents in the African church. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. Yeah, well,
original sin, as I mentioned in the preface, is not in the Bible. It's an interpretation of Adam and Eve. I mean, most people who've read Adam and Eve and had Adam and Eve haven't interpreted it in the way that the Western Church interpreted it. Now, and we've sort of absorbed that. It's easy to forget that because we've sort of taken it on board as well, and we think that that's how other people read it. It's an interpretation, and there was Augustine, who was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa in the late 4th, early 5th century. He obviously drew on sort of traditions in the Christian church, but it was still being contested even in the Catholic Church at that point. And it was he who formulated the doctrine of original sin into a doctrine, and eventually got the church to sign off on it, and it becomes, you know, official dogma. Before that, it wasn't. And the context for this is partly the Augustine's own personal struggles. Some of you might have heard of his book Confessions, which, I mean, it'd be so great if Augustine was here and he could talk about his book Confessions, because it's still, I mean, you know, it's sort of never been out of print, except that there wasn't print, of course, but it's never, this is one of the great classics of Western literature. And it's a very modern book, and it's a very Western book in the sense, because he's looking within. But he's not writing his autobiography in the sense of... most people write autobiographies because they want to show how their life was different or special or in some ways, you know, interesting. He's wanting to show that his life is the representative, his struggles are borne by all. It's precisely that it's not unique. His struggles with controlling his sexual desire, his struggles with his innate sense of sin, is something he says is shared by everybody. So just as important for, you know, his famous struggles to achieve celibacy, his story of stealing a pear when he was an adolescent, and he had no need of the pear and he just stole it for the thrill of it, you know, and he didn't even want to eat the pear when he had it, he just wanted to steal the pear, you know. So it's this sort of looking within, and from the looking within, he thinks he gets the universal story. The universal story is that we all carry the this legacy, this inclination to sin within us. But the reason why it gets, there's been many different ideas in the first few centuries of the Christian era, lots of competing ideas. Why is this one adopted? Well, I think we do have to look at the context. It's the breakup of the Roman Empire. I mean, when Augustine's dying, still writing on original sin in his last days as an old man, the Vandals are besieging Hippo. They're at the gates of the town. This is a man living through tumultuous times. And we know that as the political order was breaking down, the Catholic Church really sort of steps up, and people want it to step up as well. I mean, they want some sort of unified order, some sort of location of authority. And this doctrine was useful both in terms of giving sanction to political power to control Christians, because under the alternative tradition, if Christians are free people born in Christ, they have a new freedom. Well, under Augustine's teaching, they're still sinners as well. They still need that political sanction, they still need that political control, and he even sanctions the use of force sometimes against dissidents. Sometimes they need to be brought into line even through the use of force, because we live in a fallen world.
Yes.
So this is part of the context. It's useful for justifying the church, which is supposed to be a sort of brotherhood of believers and even occasionally sisterhood, imposing its very occasionally, unfortunately, imposing its order on this sort of ragshaggle group of both barbarian tribes, but also different Christian groups. The Catholic Church does not have a monopoly of Christianity at this time. And if you think, what I haven't mentioned is that the way out of original sin, the other side of it, is that there's also universal grace available through a baptism in the Catholic Church. So if you're a little bit unsure, even if you're not really, at least get your child baptised. You're guaranteed then, and it's almost a precautionary procedure. So he's not only offering, he's presenting the problem, but he's also presenting the solution. The salvation is available through baptism, and once you're baptised, you become a member of the church. So it's a terrific sort of. It's a pretty good selling message in terms of explaining why everybody needs to be baptised in the Catholic Church.
So he's a pretty good politician, really.
Yeah, he was. He certainly was. He wrote enormously and spread his message, and was a great cultural warrior, really. Yeah.
Yes, there's an image in the book of the number of sermons that he wrote, and of people spreading that message throughout the empire. Not dissimilar, I suppose, to the internet, but a bit harder to do back then. Now, in contrast to, as you were saying, James, this is all being contested at this particular time, and so Augustine didn't have the only idea about the nature of human nature. There was a British-born fellow by the name of Pelagius who argued against the doctrine of original sin. Do you think in the end it was theology or politics which really won out?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The idea's always been contested. It's very important to remember that. The doctrine has never been the only, even Western Christian tradition. It's been the dominant one, but not the only one, and it was fiercely contested at the time. And there really was in the 420s, an equivalent of a cultural war. These great pamphlet wars, they were fighting it out. The followers, Pelagius was a British Celtic monk not a monk, but a Celtic holy man who'd come to Rome, we're not sure when, but sometime in the second half of the 4th century. And it was just the time in the last decades of the 4th century when the wealthy people in Rome were starting to adopt Christianity. It had actually taken quite a long time before the wealthy elite, quite many decades after the conversion of Constantine, before the privileged classes became widely Christian. But of course then they also set in all the compromises to Christianity. It became quite lax. And, you know, you got baptised, but you didn't want to change too much of your other life. And Pelagius had come across, and he was an ascetic, and he was saying, look, no, you've got to, you know, follow the teachings of Jesus. It's a bit tougher than all this, and lived an ascetic life himself. And it's interesting, he believed, though, in the innate goodness of creation. It's so that within us all, this is the great sort of division, almost the alternative creation story. We're made in the image of God. So that deep within us, for him, was that goodness, and then layered over that is our sin. And the sin is caused by our moral actions, our moral choices. And this was... So he was appalled by the idea that you could believe in a God in which an innocent baby, with a newborn baby, a newborn baby for the in that tradition is the face of God. It's the image of God, you know, versus to see the newborn baby as a sinner to him was a great heresy, you know. So this debate was ferocious. But whether politics or theology won out, I mean, I think if it hadn't been for the political context of the time, they would probably both have been able to carry within this diverse Catholic tradition that existed. The reason why there had to be a winner and a loser, and Pelagianism became a heresy, was because of the political context of the breakup of the Western Empire. Like in the eastern part of the Roman Empire could afford these notions of the divine spark in every human being, and that human beings were innately good, and they could continue to live with that. But in the West, we're facing this political disintegration. We're facing the sort of some real ferocious challenges, and they want the imposition of order. They want they need a clear justification of why everybody has to be saved. Everyone has to be baptised in the church and accept the authority of the Catholic Church. And it's actually very difficult to justify why everybody needs to be saved if you don't have an explanation of universal sin.
Yes.
You know, even the good people under Augustine's teaching were stuffed unless they got a Catholic baptism.
Right.
So there was, you know, it fitted and worked for the context of the time. So I suppose it is largely, in that context, politics rather than theology.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as you say in the book, Pelagius helped Augustine and the church really refine that as well because of the counterposition that he had. You argue that, though, there's still some evidence of that, what you call a Pelagian thread running through the history of British and Irish Christianity, and I wondered if perhaps you could speak to that a little bit as well. I was certainly curious about it with the tradition of dumping convicts in Australia.
Yeah. Well, Celtic Christianity is a fascinating tradition. I mean, the indigenous Christianity of the British Isles and Ireland. It's a spiritual tradition that is really spoken to me, and I mean, I have to say there is a lot of projection onto it historically. Those of us, you know, who, you know, it's not quite the sort of New Age fantastic thing that it's sometimes presented to be, but there is no doubt that it was. I mean, the reason we have a separate Christian tradition there is because after the breakup of the Roman Empire, as you probably know, Britain was left on its own for quite a while, but the Christians continued to be there, and the church continued really on its own way for a few hundred years, and it was something quite different from the Roman Church. Whatever those differences might have been exaggerated by some people, but there's no doubt that the place of women, the role of nature, the understanding of God was quite different in the Celtic tradition. Like, for example, you had monasteries made up of men and women, sometimes headed by a woman. I mean, impossible to imagine in the Roman Church. A lot of the prayers are infused with the notion of the divine in nature and in everyday life, and in the innate goodness of creation, and including human nature. So the Celtic Church had a couple of hundred years, and then it got eventually brought in under control of Rome, and I won't go into all the details of that, but there is an argument that within the British Church, this sort of thread of Pelagianism, if you like, runs through it. And you can see that in a lot of the emphasis. I mean, we still carry it with it a bit today, the idea that Christianity is really more about what you do rather than what you believe. I mean, you'll hear that even in our culture. And even someone like John Wesley, the most famous evangelical, who did believe in original sin, very influential evangelical in 18th century England. But he also, was pragmatic as well. Your faith has got to be expressed in your actions. Yeah. And let's not get too tied up with doctrine. It's about, your faith doesn't mean anything unless you're living it. And this sort of quite sort of common sense-y sort of practical Christianity has always been quite strong in Britain, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there aren't many women featured in your book. You've raised women there. We've had a little bit of a snicker before. Lots of people, of course, would recognise Christianity, along with many other religions, as being dominated by men. But you do talk about some women in the book quite explicitly. If we skip ahead in time now to the late 14th century, and I was wondering if perhaps you could talk about them, because there's at least one British one, as I recall, in there.
Well, that's Julian of Norwich, and those of you who haven't heard of Julian Norwich, I'd give a big plug for her, and her book, because her book Revelations of Divine Love is actually the first book written in English by a woman, and so it surely deserves honour, even just for that.
Just for that, yes, I agree.
But then it's actually an extraordinary book, and she was what we call an anchoress. She attached herself to St Julian's Church in Norwich and lived in the cell. She wasn't an isolated hermit, though. People would come to her for advice and counsel. She's considered a wise woman, a spiritual leader. And she wrote down this, and even today, it's quite confronting book to read, in the sense that she talks of God as mother. She uses a maternal language for the divine. I mean, it's still quite radical.
It is,
and in many ways a very modern, confronting book. And as far as she can go, she confronts many of the assumptions of the dominant male church. And she's also wanting to give solace and comfort to people, get beyond the fear. She's living in the generation of the plague. And so it's a beautiful book. I mean, obviously there's some big cultural differences still there for us, and there's a whole lot of stuff in there that many of us won't believe. But it's also in some ways a very modern book, and she's been rediscovered and probably more read now than she's ever been read. And there are other women mystics at this time through Europe who also, I think, seem to be more open, or carriers of the alternative Christian tradition. Some of you might have heard of Hildegard of Bingen, a remarkable German woman who is a true Renaissance woman in a way. I mean, she was a composer and a poet and a healer and a scientist and just incredibly diverse. And I mean, this gutsy woman goes off in her early 60s around, preaching to male clerics about how corrupt they are and how they've got to reform their ways, and what a gutsy spirit, And so I talk about these people really as an example of how they're there's never been one story. There's never one story. There's always been these other dissenting and different traditions.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that I really enjoyed that about your sensitivity too, James, to the women and to the lack of women in history, and making a particular point of pointing to them. You mentioned Wesley, who's of course associated with the Protestant divide in Christianity between the Catholics and the Protestants. Do you think there is much difference when it comes to original sin between those two divisions in the Church?
Well, the Reformation, most of you will know about the Reformation in 16th century Europe, when the Church divides between the Protestant streams and the Catholic stream. But in fact, the Reformation is built really on original sin. It's because what troubled sort of reformers like Luther Luther, Luther famously says, as the centre of the Reformation is that you're saved by faith alone. All of these other things that the Church preaches, that you can somehow sort of shortcut your way to heaven by indulgences or by penance or by pilgrimage, or prayers to the saints or whatever. All these things, Luther says, are nonsense. Only faith can save you. Faith in God alone is the only way. Faith is everything. Grace, the grace of God through Christ. But why is this so? Because human beings are so corrupted by their very nature, so fallen by their nature, that there's no good that we can do. There's no way we can earn any merit in God's eyes, no matter how good a human being you are. Doesn't matter if you're a celibate monk to Luther. I mean, Luther himself had been a monk, and the monks are supposed to be, leading the life that's closest to heaven. But Luther says, no, as a celibate monk, you're no more favourable in God's eyes than the most sort of wretched sort of criminal or murderer. You're all the same in God's eyes because of original sin. We're all innately fallen, innately sinners, and even our good actions are corrupted. So that's why this total reliance on God's grace, God's mercy, and all these human mediated ways are sort of a corruption. So original sin and the Reformation are closely tied up, and particularly with John Calvin and Calvinism, it's very central to Calvin's beliefs. And of course it's Calvinism, or the Reformed Church tradition, that part of the Protestant tradition, which then gets carried across to North America, and then we all know what happens after that. Original sin thrives in the New World.
Right, so as you can tell, this book spans quite a lot of time, so we're going to skip ahead a bit in time again. James, you make the assertion that even what is known as the Age of Enlightenment opened up, challenged many long-held religious beliefs, but original sin, you reckon, still had an impact because, and I'm quoting, it was not only a religious dogma, it also supplied a framework in which to understand what it meant to be human. And so I was wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah, and I'll just reassure people before we get into the Enlightenment that you get to the Enlightenment in about 100 pages. So you must have been thinking, oh gosh, this book sounds very heavy and long-winded, but
no, it's very accessible.
It does. We move along through the centuries at a nice rocketing pace.
Very speedily.
So, so I mean, really, the argument I'm making there is that. Mostly, I mean, traditionally the Enlightenment was seen as this great break with the Christian past. Here we go, we're sort of Christendom and all this sort of religious stuff. Then along comes the Enlightenment, people realise it's all a load of bollocks, and we have the beginning of the secular and scientific and rational age. Now, historians don't write about the Enlightenment like that anymore, and because most of the Enlightenment thinkers were Christians. And there was actually there was some sort of pretty vocal anti-clerical group, especially in France, but there's a lot of continuity between the pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, not surprisingly, I suppose. But it is true, though, that even the Christian Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers, most of them did think original sin was a load of bollocks, or at least as how it had been traditionally understood by the church, because it's not rational, is it? How can we all share in the sin of some primeval ancestor? It's not my sin, it was his sin. That sort of irrationality offended them, and they also found the whole idea that the fear that came with it, and the notion, this. I mean, poor old ordinary people of Europe, I mean, they're petrified that their baby's going to go to hell if it hasn't been baptised, This sort of superstition, what they would have thought of as superstition, they wanted to construct a rational religion. And so original sin didn't fit with that. But, and because of that, people have assumed that original sin died, at least outside of the churches. But the difficulty with this thinking is that original sin wasn't just a religious doctrine. It was also an understanding of what it meant to be human. You know, it had deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about human nature, about who we were, that there were sort of just flaws in our nature and makeup. Now, what I'm suggesting as a conversation starter, really, rather than a sort of, lobby hole for me to say this is definite. I mean, it's something to think about, is that there's cultural continuity there in their understanding of human nature. And it's precisely because they were so down on the religious dogma that we miss that continuity about how we understand human beings.
Okay, all right, excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so I think it was Charles Darwin's birthday a couple of weeks ago, according to Facebook. He's been an enormous influence in the West. But James, you're not entirely happy with what you call his attempt to apply evolutionary science to human nature. So, and in that way, I think your book is fairly iconoclastic, because there's a number of these key cultural figures who get you have a different view on them. So what's your point about Charles Darwin?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose I go through a few key figures as examples of the point I was making before. You know, people like Adam Smith, some of the early founding fathers of America are all examples of this. You know, they sort of share this fairly gloomy view of innate human nature, and then construct economic and political systems around that. But the Charles Darwin, it really is the anthropology, if you like, of original sin really gets a revival with evolutionary theory. It really gets a scientific language is given. Now, I'm not talking about the origins of species. Don't worry, I don't literally believe. One person at one point thought that I was came up to me quite angrily because they thought I still believed in the historical figures of Adam and Eve. So let's get that clear. I don't believe in there were two people called Adam and Eve, and I do accept that the origins of species is one of the great scientific intellectual achievements of all time. Yeah. And we're not talking about that book, and we're not talking about the truth of evolution, but Darwin wrote a second book called The Descent of Man, and that book is Darwin recognised that human beings are pretty complex creatures culturally and socially, and that evolutionary theory, we needed not just the evolutionary theory could explain how a man, as he put it, came into being, but how do we explain human progress, human civilization, the diversity of cultures? And like many people, this is a challenge that we've never really answered. And if you look at it, the speed of change in human culture in the last 10,000 years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms, is extraordinary. So, and Darwin sort of basically assumes that human beings are naturally competitive. The survival of the fittest, if you like to use that glib phrase, is an essential and inevitable part of the human condition, that we are all out for ourselves, and we're sort of competing with one another. I mean, he doesn't discard notions of virtue and notions of morality altogether, but he has trouble fitting them into his schema. And he has, I mean, when you read some of what he writes about women and what he writes about traditional primitive societies, you realise he's really absorbing much of the culture of his time, and it's not a scientific work in the way that The Origin of Species is, and yet it was a very influential work in terms of lots of, we now call it social Darwinist thinking. Yes. It had a big cultural impact, and my suggestion in the book is that why was there such a resonance for these ideas is partly explained by the fact that they were giving a scientific language to what actually Western people already believed to be true, but since the decline of religion had lost a language to describe. This idea that we are really sort of in ourselves still carry these these powerful instinctual negative drives, and we're not naturally. It's not our natural way to be sort of compassionate and to work cooperatively. Our natural way is to be aggressive to each other and competing with each other, you know?
Yes, yes.
There's a sort of common-sensey thing that fits for us.
Yes.
And that, you know, I think there we're speaking of some of the legacy, some of our ancestral memories, some of our ancestral way of understanding what it means to be human.
Which is an interesting thought, and I hope it generates some discussion about that, because you also talk about Freud as well, and if we go back to the idea of sex and Augustine struggling with his desires, and Freud's kind of obsession really with sexual drives and what he thought of as our perversity as part of the heart of human nature. Do you see this as similar to Darwin, that he's just picking up and trying to justify in some sort of scientific language that we are like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult because, I mean, I see, this is why I talk about it as a creation story. You know, if we're actually quite wise in how we see creation stories now. If we're talking about creation stories for Indigenous cultures, we know that they can be influential in a way that's not about them being literally true or even being morally upright, don't we? I mean, we know that they sort of influence. It's not directly the creation story causes this belief and this belief and this belief. It's like a current underwriting the culture. It's sort of, it's not a. There's always other factors involved. I mean, no one would want to, for example, explain the complexity and vibrancy and diversity of an Aboriginal culture just by their creation story. Yet we know that the creation stories also influence everything, you know? It's a subtle and nuanced thing. It's not, and we don't sort of, the point of whether the creation story is literally true or not is not the point. The point whether the creation story is morally upright and worth it is not the point. We don't get into tangles about that. We recognise their importance within the living culture, and that's a bit like we've got a creation story as well.
Yes.
You know, we're a bit too arrogant. We just assume that that's all stuff for other people. I'm suggesting that there's one in our culture that's also shaped who we are.
Yes.
And so with Freud, that's the sort of argument I'm making. Not that this is, you know, you literally can just apply that Freud is just reproducing original sin. It's not as crude an argument as that, but it is saying that Freud is carrying within him, he too is part of a culture, and when he speaks of these deep instinctual drives in us that are right at our very being, that might be able to be controlled but they can never be banished, these sexual drives, these drives to violence, that they're deep within us. I'm suggesting, you know, this, you can't prove this scientifically. I mean, he says you can, but of course it's not a, this is a culturally derived assumption. So where does it come from? And I'm suggesting this is part of its origins. So it's that sort of argument that I'm making, and the fact that Freud himself is a fierce, you know, atheist and thinks religion is is rubbish. That sort of disguises that truth, because that's not actually the point. You know, it's not about whether you believe in religion or not. It's about the fact that we are all born into a culture. We all carry ancestral memory within us. You know, none of us can completely begin again. But if we bring some of this stuff into the light and into the openness, we can have more choices about it. Yeah. Have a conversation about it. Yeah.
Well, speaking about science and proving what's true and not, and arrogance, you also talk about Richard Hawkins as well, because he does suggest that there is a selfish gene, that at the heart of human nature we are selfish. Do you reckon he's just carrying again the cultural heritage? Yeah,
and also the response to his work, you know, the way that evolutionary psychology, I mean, it's really on the fringes of science and respectable science, because it's not falsifiable. I mean, as I was talking about before, most of the changes in human behaviour in the last 10,000 years can't be explained by evolution, you know. And so Dawkins invents an idea of a meme, which is a sort of cultural transition unit, but you can't see a meme or study or observe a meme. So you're really dealing here with sort of cultural ideas. And I think, yes, the sort of resonance of his ideas, again, he's giving a scientific language to what we'd always believed to be true. But also, I mean, we haven't talked a lot about today. The other side of it is the search for salvation. I should have mentioned with the Enlightenment and all the periods since. Of course, the religious, how do you get saved from this sense of something wrong with us? The religious salvation is gone now, so you need secular forms of salvation. And all these different thinkers are actually also offering various secular forms of salvation, including Dawkins, who believes that we can rise above our evolutionary nature, that we're not just victims of our evolutionary nature. And in fact, he wants to educate us about our nature so we can rise above it, you know, so we can start practicing benevolence and compassion. For Adam Smith, it was acceptance of, and the market itself provided some sort of grace, really, unintentionally. I mean, Freud sort of struggled to. The couch never seemed to quite deliver all that it promised, the psychoanalytic couch, but at least it was, you know, you could, with people who could undertake analysis and try and sort of understand themselves, and civilization too could control these instinctual drives to a point.
Yeah, so there was some good intentions at the base of that. Yeah,
we need a form of salvation, and I think that's a, you know, it's a theme of Western history, this restless seeking to find, and you can see this theme being played out in all sorts of areas.
James, are you up for answering some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
We've got a microphone just in the middle aisle here. If anybody has some questions they'd like to put to James.
Thank you, James. Would you take it onwards to very modern, well, not so modern necessarily, but things like detective novels where we want it all to win, you know, we want the detective to find the answer, and Hollywood movies that, you know, end with a redemption, and we long for that it will be all right in the end?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that how much I didn't explore how it was played out in literature and films and other forms of contemporary culture, but I think you could do that. Especially they're looking for redemption. Is a theme of a lot of literature and movies, but it's not something I've explored. But I think it's, you know, I think it could be. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right at the beginning, you referred to the Western influence not originating in this original sin, yet we've got across Christianity the concept of baptism, and going right back to the Adam and Eve story. What can you comment?
So the tradition of baptism
precedes.
I think it's not a Western thing only.
No,
I think it's cross-Christian.
It is. That's a really good point. The infant baptism, we're not really sure of the origins because it's not in the Bible, of course, infant baptism. Adult baptism, you know, Jesus was baptised as an adult, and the very first Christians, it seems to have been adult baptism. But from a very early period, we're not even sure when, but it seems to be within, you know, sort of 100 years or so of the death of Christ, we have infant baptism coming in, and I think we assumably it's a source of, at a time of high infant mortality, it is a source of great comfort to people to have their children baptised. But Augustine, in fact, one of his arguments for original sin is to say, well, look, this gives us a theological explanation as to why we have infant baptism. Why do we baptise an infant if they're not sinners? And original sin provided that explanation. But you're quite right that infant baptism itself existed beforehand, and this was a sort of post-event justification, and it's in the other Christian traditions, you know, a number of other Christian traditions as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you comment or contrast on how Eastern religions, and probably going further around the globe and under the globe, other cultural beliefs, have operated without that concept of original sin.
Other religions?
Yeah, and you talked about Eastern Christianity not being so imbued with it. Yeah,
and I mean, there's always a tension, even in Western Christianity, you've had that tension of the divine. I mean, you can go two ways. You can either put the emphasis on, and it's about emphasis, I suppose, rather. If we're innately good, if we've got the image of God in us, so we've got that divine spark within our being, and then sin is something that's over the top of that. So the process of conversion or the process of becoming Christian or growing in the faith is stripping away, is revealing, learning to see what's already there. So God is everywhere and present in all of life, and we're learning to see that. You know, that's what conversion is. It's learning to see the reality that is already present. While in the original sin tradition, you're having to get an external source of salvation. There's something sort of wrong with the fall, there's wrong with the human condition, wrong with nature. Now, the Eastern Christian tradition puts greater emphasis on what I've just said, the first one, so that the process of conversion is that, you know, learning to see the divine spark within human beings rather than, you know, this need for an external source of salvation. And I mean, it's fairly rare for a religion to have banished this is, in the end, I think, the problem with original sin. I mean, there's much wisdom. We haven't talked about that today, but there is actually, paradoxically, quite a lot of wisdom in this tradition, I discovered to my surprise. We haven't had a chance. Some of that's in the book as well. It's not all about... and the religious doctrine itself is obviously, well, I think obviously sort of fairly absurd, but there's wisdom there as well, particularly in the sense that we are all fallen, limited creatures. It gives a sort of release to that. There's a solidarity in our brokenness. You know, it's a great source of human solidarity to know, you know, that we're not meant to be perfect and we can't be perfect. We're just limited, frail people. That can be a comfort as well as a critique. But most religions have put stress, haven't banished the divine like original sin did. I mean, with original sin, Adam and Eve, they left the Garden of Eden, and God abandoned them, you know, and abandoned the world. And really all they were doing was being human, you know. And God was angry at that. And other religions emphasise God's presence in all of life and in the world. Not all. I mean, obviously, I'm generalising massively here. And elements of the Christian tradition, including the Eastern tradition, do that as well. Yeah. Is that a sort of a bit of a mumble? Yeah. It's complicated, isn't it?
It
is. Like, isn't it? It's sort of amazing that we're here talking about God here on a beautiful morning in Adelaide. It's great.
And you're not supposed to be doing that these days anyway. It's kind of out of fashion.
We're being culturally countercultural through revolutionaries.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. And we've got time for another one, I think.
Now, original sin would seem to be an attempt to explain the existence of evil or doing bad things.
Yeah.
What are the alternatives?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where... That's a good question. And, I mean, my book is about what people have believed to be true rather than what is true. Can I just emphasise that? I mean, I don't know what is true any more than any of you know. And that problem of evil, of course, is something that every human being born into this earth struggles with. How do you explain evil? And that's been the great question. And original sin was one explanation for that. And it's quite a powerful explanation for it, that it's innate within human beings. I don't think that's a satisfactory explanation myself. But in terms of what the answer is, you know, obviously we get into certain, you know, structural realities and other... But there is... I mean, I'm not denying that there is some wisdom in that tradition, as I said before, and I try, I think, in the book, to get beyond this need to either defend the doctrine... Almost everything written on original sin is either out to bash it or to defend it. It's like these fierce lines of... I'm trying in the book, I don't know if I've succeeded, but just to look at it and say, well, look, this is something that our ancestors believed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this has influenced and shaped our culture today, and it's shaped us today. I just want to have a look at it and bring it into the light and have a conversation about it, rather than become another participant in this ongoing war of either being a defender of it or bashing it. You know, I don't know if I succeed, but that's my aim. Yeah. I'll have to leave it to all of us for another, to continue to grapple with the problem of evil, which is who has an easy answer to that one?
We've got time for one last quick question. Thank you.
You mentioned that one of the basis for your story is that we think that there's a problem with us and that we try and fix it with, falling for advertising and everything. But then that Christianity sometimes frowns upon a lot of scientific evidence. And I wonder if you think it's sort of ironic that we are broken, or the original sin is that we want curiosity and understanding, and to fix ourselves we try and understand and be curious about it, but it's sort of that whole thing.
No, that's a good question. Thanks. Yeah, I think that I do think that this is speculation. Historians don't like really writing about what people believe, spiritual stuff, because it's actually quite hard to access and it's all a bit difficult, historically. But it does leave an enormous gap in Western history, how we write history. And I do think the way we've understood the divine is part of the explanation for both the vibrancy and the restlessness of Western culture. So Western people, if you look, it's been a pretty amazing history of Western peoples over the last few hundred years. And it both in good sense, in scientific exploration and all this sort of incredible discoveries and new insights, but also, of course, in a bad sense, been conquered great chunks of the planet and dispossessed millions of people, and we've, moved ourselves across the globe, into other people's homelands. And it's, I think, obviously there's many causes to this stuff, but part of it, I think, it's hard to fully grasp why this is all going on if you don't look at our creation story. It's because it's quite an extraordinary creation story, and it does talk about this sort of, that there's something wrong with us just because of who we are. And it gives, once you sort of look at that, it gives a sort of clue to understanding, at least getting another dimension of understanding something of what's going on in the West. But of course, not the full answer. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have any time for further questions. You've been a fabulous audience. Thank you very much for being here today. I thought we might just finish very quickly, if you could, James, comment on a point that you make in the book, which I really love, and this idea of original blessing.
Yeah. Well, that's a term coined by Matthew Fox and probably others, but yes, the alternative tradition is that we are born blessed. Yeah, that we are the newborn baby is the image of the divine, and that we are in our very heart and our essence good, and then there's a whole lot of stuff that comes in over the top of that, a whole lot of messy stuff. Yeah. Original blessing is a lovely term. Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Shall I close with my last few lines? How about that? I'll just close with my last, because we started with my first few lines. Yeah. And these words, so I'll just give you a... we might as well go away feeling good about ourselves, I reckon, after all this discussion about original sin. And it is, having said that I didn't have any opinion about it, I did venture a tiny opinion, but not till the very last paragraph, so I thought I'd earned it by then. If the West is ever to move beyond original sin, history suggests this will not begin with the discarding of the Doctrine's view of human nature, which is now so ingrained that even atheists promulgate it. Rather, it may involve rejecting the caricature of a God who can only be at home in a sanctified soul or lost paradise. As the present environmental crisis brings the question of salvation once more to the fore, perhaps it is time to complete the journey that Western people embarked on when God was exiled to heaven. Freedom from the bondage of original sin has not come from throwing off the chains of religion, but it might yet come by bringing grace back to earth. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Well, thanks very much to James Boyce, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.